event is presented in a spirit of listening and learning, and we are all learners here. With that in mind, we gather today to share ideas about how we can be more inclusive and leverage our work to break down barriers via this digital format, using equipment and high-speed internet that we acknowledge is not available in or accessible to many communities. This technology, which for many of us has become central to our daily lives, leaves a significant footprint and contributes to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous people as well as other marginalized groups. Although we are here together virtually, separated by distance in different geographical locations, collectively, we all sit on unceded land that was once occupied and inhabited by hundreds of Native tribes. This is a history that we must acknowledge since it affects our present and will continue to impact our future. We humbly seek to understand our place within this context as individuals and organizations, and we encourage you all to reflect on this as well. Thank you again to the Art of Access Alliance Denver members, to Access Gallery, the Denver Art Museum, and Redline for their support for today's Lunch and Learn. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Amy Siegel. With over 30 years of experience in the corporate realm of design, Amy happily transitioned into the nonprofit world in January of 2020 to work for Access Gallery as their marketing and sales specialist and in-house designer. In her current role, she has an opportunity to convey the unique story of an inclusive arts-based nonprofit organization that opens doors to creative, educational, and economic opportunities for people with disabilities. She does this through the power of design, branding, and most importantly, human relationships. Prior to her work at Access Gallery, Amy was a senior graphic designer for a global design firm called Gensler for many years. There, she gained extensive experience in many areas of graphic design, including environmental design, wayfinding, print collateral, and branding. In 2017, Amy received the American Institute of Graphic Arts, or AIGA, Colorado Fellow Award in recognition of her significant contribution to raising the standards of excellence in practice and conduct within her local design community. We are honored to have Amy's loving and engaging presence here today and look forward to learning more from her about a subject she is clearly very passionate about. Amy, the Zoom stage is yours. Thank you all very much.
Hello, welcome. My name is Amy Siegel. Thank you very much, Jamila, for that really kind introduction. I am a white woman. I have a pixie haircut, very short gray hair. I wear black rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a black top, and I'm sitting in my home office that many of you are doing now also. So I spend some time at home, and then we're also very grateful to be back in the gallery now. Behind me is art from some of our artists at Access Gallery, and I like to surround myself with photographs, objects, things that I really love. Design is really important to me. I go by the pronouns she, her, and she, her, hers. So I want to start with way back when I went to art school in the late 70s, early 80s. That was a time before computers. And I did see cameras on earlier. So I think I do see a few folks with some gray hair like me that probably, if you are graphic designers or have knowledge of that, we're familiar with how things were done prior to the computer age. And I feel really lucky to have done that. So my typography teacher in art school, I had 2 years of typography, really drilled into me the grid and type and doing things neatly and cleanly. And I came to Denver in 1979 to visit cousins he was a printer and offered me a job in the summer. So I was working in publishing. And at that time, that was paste up and layout and design and cutting. And things had to be really precise, because if you made a mistake, it showed up in the final print. And maybe you're printing thousands of books or newsletters or publications. So I feel like I got a really good training early on. And I started out in print graphics, so two-dimensional, and then my first year was just as a working for an ad agency. And then I got my job at Gensler, and I started out doing print work, strictly two-dimensional, and then got more into environmental graphic design. And something that is really true to both print and environmental graphic design is putting the user first. You know, who's looking at your printed materials? Who's looking at your website? When you go into a space, how are you experiencing it? And what are some of the obstacles, and what makes something easier? And that's really how I want you to think about as we go through this present. I have a presentation, and as Jamila said, please feel free to put something in the chat or interrupt, turn your mic on, camera on, and ask questions if anything doesn't make sense. And if I'm sharing my screen and nothing is showing, please let me know. So welcome. I absolutely love typography, and I love color and fonts, and I'm gonna, oops, sorry, it's not advancing. Well, what we want to talk about today is accessible graphic design. And I could easily spend an hour just on typefaces. So we're going to kind of walk through, and maybe some of this is basic, maybe some of this is new to some of you. So just from the standpoint of explaining and making things accessible. So right off the bat, the best contrast, and contrast is so important in typography and graphic design, anything from signage to print material. And the black on white or white on black is really the strongest, or light on dark, dark on white. And I don't know if you know, we've all been pretty much on Zoom, but if you've been in a presentation in person and you're in a big auditorium and everything is on a white background with black copy, things start to disappear, right? And so there's really a difference between printed material on screen on your computer and then in a space. So that's something that you really want to be aware of too, is what is that condition? And so when we're designing for accessibility, we want to provide easier access to information, to ideas, public spaces, and just be smarter and more effective with our communications. And that's also just simplifying things too, because, and I know I'm guilty of this, start to try to describe things in greater detail, and really simpler is easier for everybody. So according to the World Health Organization, 15% of the world's population has a disability. And as we age, our eyesight, I wear glasses. Some days I have a condition where my vision is just blurry, and I'll go for a couple of days where it's hard for me to read. I have different sets of glasses that are stronger, and even then sometimes it's blurry. So bigger copy is always going to be easier for me. So inclusive design, when we say inclusive, it's considering the wide range of human abilities. And when we design for inclusivity, it opens our services to more people. And really, it just reflects who we all are. And we all have different abilities. So what we're going to start off with is typography accessibility. And just simple things like upper and lower case. And you've probably observed if you read a whole paragraph of all caps, it's really hard to read that. And then we've got, just because I'm a typography geek, there's ascenders. This is an ascender. A descender is when you're like a Y and a P and a G, anything that descends along. And if you look at this is Helvetica, and maybe you've noticed this in other fonts. where sometimes the cap letter, like the capital T and the H, they're the same height. And there are some fonts where the H goes up higher, and then some of the descenders, if it's more of a decorative font, go below. So then your eye is really kind of all over the place and you get distracted. And then spacing, just simple things like spacing between letters. So we're going to be talking about typeface, font. Maybe you know what the difference is. There is a difference between typeface and font. Text size, weight, legibility, stroke, leading, alignment, column spacing, color contrast, margins, grids, paragraph spacing, all of those things. And something that you'll notice too is that there's a distinct grid within this presentation, because that'll make it easier for you to follow along also. So if things were changing, flush left, flush right throughout, your eye is bouncing all over the place. And then it's distracting and maybe you're not able to really pay attention. So when it comes to selecting typefaces and fonts, you want to avoid really complicated or decorative typefaces. And then there's ADA guidelines also. And then another thing to consider is some of you may work on a PC, some on a Mac. So you're maybe Microsoft or you're on an Apple. And if fonts change in default, and there's several fonts that are the same on both. So then you don't have the issue of fonts defaulting and things even being harder to read. So there's 4 main types of fonts. And then we're going to be talking mostly about sans serif and serif. And in signage, there's specific fonts that are ADA compliant that are sans serif and serif. So sans serif is pretty simple. It doesn't have these little serifs. And then when we get into decorative typefaces, so the one on the left, to me, it could be a G, maybe a J if I'm reading it backwards, and that's a T. So we really want to avoid using fonts that are decorative because the letters are not recognizable. And while this is maybe a fun, scary font, it's a T, but not 100% sure. So you really want to be very selective when you're using decorative typefaces. So these are 3 sans serif typefaces that are available through Microsoft, Apple. So you're not going to have the issue of defaulting fonts. So that's really important. So Helvetica, Arial, and Verdana. And those are all ADA compliant fonts. And then as far as serif, these are all ADA compliant also. But as you can see, they start to get really more decorative, and maybe they're harder to read. Like that W, it's really beautiful, but it is more difficult to read. So you want to be selective with that. And maybe you do use a serif for a headline or something if you want to have a little bit more decorative. But when you have bodies, like a lot of copy, it tends to get harder to read. And especially a serif on a reverse background where you've got light on dark, you can start to lose some of those intricacies of those serifs. So typeface or font. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where we're starting to talk about the differences. And I know what the difference is. And I read this, this description, or, and I had to read it 3 times. I was like, wait a minute, I'm not sure if I really understand what this means, what the main difference is, a typeface or a type family. is the name of a specific collection of related fonts. And I started to get really confused. And for me, and I don't know about you, but I'm very visual, and when I put together IKEA furniture or anything that has lots of directions, I need diagrams and photos. I start to glaze over when I see a lot of copy. So in this case, it's creating a diagram which starts to break it up, and then it makes more sense. So, oh, okay, I get this. Typeface is Helvetica. That's the name of the typeface. And then within that typeface, there's all these different weights. So that's the font. We have Helvetica Ultra Light, Thin, Thin Italic. So Helvetica Light, Helvetica Regular, Helvetica Medium, Medium Italic. And then as you can see, the light is so fine that it's hard to read. And that's not something where you're going to want to use paragraphs of ultra light. It's going to be very difficult to read. Maybe it's more decorative and it's really large on a poster. And then you really want to stay away from condensed. It's much harder to read. The letters are closer together and condensed. And then also italics can make it very difficult to read also. So sticking, and then in a document, you don't want to have 5 or 6 different weights of copy, because again, that starts to make it very difficult to read and concentrate. But it does help when you've got a body of copy and you really want to emphasize something. So that's where using a regular and a bold font. So an example of this, like Helvetica Regular is great for body copy when you have paragraphs of copy. Medium is a good choice when you're reversing copy out of a dark background. If you use bold, sometimes the bold letters get too tight and they start to blur together. And then bold is great for a headline. So an example of that, and then taking a look at what hierarchy. So when maybe you're putting together a newsletter for your organization, or you have a handout and you want the headline, so you know what it's about, and that's bold. And in this case, this is about the movie Helvetica. And then oftentimes people are in a hurry, and maybe they want the main information about what this event is, what the movie's about, the newsletter. So highlighting that and using some color and contrast to highlight that information, and that sets up a hierarchy of what you're reading. And then keeping the body copy in regular, because it's easier. And then the other part of it is the spacing between the letters. We've got 2 columns. So it's okay with larger copy to have a wider column, but if we were to have all of our information in the smaller copy in a wide column, it's difficult to follow, for your eye to follow a long length of copy. So what we're really creating is this hierarchy of information. So the grid, this is especially important, and I feel like this was just driven into me in art school, and then working in publications and layout and design and doing publications, how important the grid is. And the great thing about a grid too, and not sure what kind of programs people in design, if you are familiar with it or can get familiar with it, is an amazing program for setting up a grid and being consistent with it. So you can see that these are the margins, is your space around from top, bottom, sides. And then the center is called the gutter. And that's the amount of spacing between your columns. And your line lengths for a column you want to stay between 50 and 80, but 75 in that range is really good. So grids really establish these guidelines for how your elements should be positioned in a layout. And that's your copy, your images, your headline, your body copy, and then ways to break up a body of copy too by using bullets and then using bold copy so that you're really emphasizing, in this case, the clarity and order and efficiency and economy and consistency and harmony. And hopefully you've noticed into this presentation that this grid has been consistent throughout to this point. So hopefully that makes it easier to follow. So there's multiple types of grids, and it could be, for instance, 9 squares. So this gives you the opportunity. You've got a grid. Here's an image, copy. This is a very familiar grid used in newsletters. So this might be the header and then columns of copy. So there's just a multitude of grids, and really trying to keep it as simple as possible and consistent. Like consistency is so important from page to page, or even your branding, because then people will recognize your branding, your grid, your materials. So even this grid, while it's a 16 column grid, and this is pretty complicated, but if you notice, it's still lined up. It's still a grid, and there's proportions, and it's a specific grid that's been followed. So can you tell that I like the grid? So then moving on to color and contrast, that it's good to use color, but you want to use color in moderation, because there needs to be enough contrast between the text and the background, but you want to avoid using colored text on a colored background. And then also when you have paragraphs of copy on the left side where we have the black copy on white, it's much easier to read. And if you're looking at larger copy that's reversed out, the white copy on a dark background, it's a sentence or two. So you're not reading paragraph after paragraph. And on the right side, where it's white copy on a black background, it's really hard to read, and it's hard on your eyes. And if you notice that the letters start to blur together a little bit also. So you really want to avoid doing paragraphs of white copy on a dark background. So color and contrast are really important. So for example, this top portion of white copy on a dark teal background, that's high contrast. And below it, the low contrast, green copy on an orange background, you can't read it. So, and I think you'll see that quite often in some branded materials, and where companies want to infuse their branded colors as much as possible, but you really want to avoid doing that low contrast tone or color on color. And text alignment. So the easiest text to read, if you're in English or you're reading from left to right, is flush left. And flush left, the reason is that your eye always goes to that flushed position. So it's easier to follow the copy. And flush right, if you are reading Hebrew or Arabic, where you're reading from right to left, that makes sense. But if we're reading English in flush right, as you can see, it's this ragged and your eye is going back to the left, and it's hard to follow that rag. And then centered, often you'll see body of copy centered. And again, that's really hard because you're not getting to this very distinct flush left. So if you're going to center copy, typically you should leave that just to headlines. And even then, I think sometimes when you have a centered copy and everything else is flush left, your eye is all over the place. And then justified copy is especially difficult because you get all these weird spaces in between letters. And most books, like, open up a novel and it is justified. So, and it is harder if it's a dyslexic user with all of those spaces. So you should really avoid using justified copy. And then, I don't know if you've heard the terms kerning and leading. So kerning is referring to the spacing between letters. And if you have too much kerning, then it makes it really difficult to read too. There's too much spacing. So this top line is too much kerning. And then there's the second line is not enough kerning because all the letters are very tight. And then the third is just right. So I guess that's the three bears, right? And I can't hear anybody laughing, and that was a stupid comment, but anyway, in signage and wayfinding, there's very specific spacing that needs to be between letters with raised tactile graphics. And then leading is your spacing between lines. So if you have too much leading, then that makes it difficult to follow. And then if there's not enough, your letters start to bunch up together. So the first two lines is too much leading, and then the second two is not enough. So if you've noticed in all the body copy, there's good leading between lines. So here's a few examples of some things that are okay, that are working, and others that are not. So what works in this newsletter template on the left, what works is very distinct columns, so it's easy to follow different topics. What's not working is the white copy on that, I don't know, light purple background. That's too much copy on a dark background. But what does work is pulling out these bold headlines. So there's headlines that are reversed out. This middle column, that yellow, is not quite enough contrast. And then this newsletter over on the right, well, I don't know, that stresses me out just looking at it. I mean, you look at that and like, what should I read first? There's 1, 2, 3, 4 different sizes, 5 different sizes of headline copy, different colors, different sizes. Things don't line up. The photographs, things reversed out. So definitely what not to do. And then this newsletter on the left is a little better, but you still have this light pink background, which the black copy is readable, but then this top portion where it's orange or red on pink there's not enough contrast in that letter. They do a good job of highlighting columns and making it interesting. There's this really nice dark red band. Again, in a situation like this, you want to limit the amount of copy. But there is a grid. Same thing with the example of the newsletter on the right, where there's 3 lines of copy, but again, then there's a lot of white copy reversed out of a purple background, which is really hard to read. So that brings me to that graphic that we had for introducing today's Lunch and Learn. And what can we do to make that more accessible? So just simplifying, like that typography is really fun, but the M on the left side kind of gets lost in that pattern. But by putting a transparency on the pattern and you see it in the background, and then increasing, having the bright red letter outlined in black, it's much bolder and more readable. And while we did talk about not doing color on color, there is enough contrast between that lighter green and the deep purple. And the lines behind the G, while that makes a really great pattern, it also, if you have any, if you have low vision, those lines start to bleed together. So just by taking that pattern out and deepening that blue, there's more contrast. Same thing with the @ symbol, having that pattern in the black on the purple was not enough contrast. So I think you get that idea. So there's ways of, just looking, testing it out yourself and seeing, okay, what's creating more contrast without losing your design intent. And while we're not going to get too much into web, this is something that I just came across a program I think it was last week. And just, sorry, I'm going to have to stop sharing and come back in. Let's see. So how many, hopefully everybody sees the website right now. Big Bud is a retailer in Los Angeles, and they have this very distinct, very fun brand. And I feel like they just added this feature, and I don't know if any of you have seen this feature on other websites, but the icon, the accessibility icon here at the bottom, when you click on that, it gives you the ability to choose different accessibility profiles for yourself. It's really amazing. So for instance, for vision impaired, when I turn that on, it automatically changed the tone. So it's built for degrading eyesight, tunnel vision, cataract, glaucoma. So it changed that copy. So let's, we'll go into shop. And it also changed the font to be just a Helvetica, a clean font versus, let's see, I'm going to turn that. So do you see how it's a kind of it's a heavier font, it's a serif, a little bit harder to read. So if I turn that on, but then I personally have a hard time reading centered copy. So you can go down, they've got all these adjustments to make. So okay, I'm gonna align everything left so that it's easier for me. And then there's a text magnifier so that you can just scroll over it and magnify the text. And then if I turn on the ADHD friendly profile, it has this highlight so that I can just highlight areas that I want to concentrate on. So I don't know, this is a game changer. And the really amazing thing is that, and we'll be sharing all this information with you. It's an automated web accessibility tool, and it updates itself every 24 hours so that your site is constantly accessible. I don't know, I was really impressed with that. And another thing I really admire about them too is their diversity and their models. They also have a program where it's Shop for All, where they offer a particular product. I think it's once a month that's a lower cost for people who may not be able to afford to purchase their clothing. So I don't work for Big Bud, but I just the fact that and I think there's more and more retailers using it. So I know that this is something that we're going to be looking into for the gallery. And then I wanted to touch a little bit on symbols and wayfinding. And again, going back to that thought, or that idea of just simplifying things. And I had an amazing opportunity to work on small regional airports up to international airports like Incheon in Seoul, Korea. So I had a lot of experience with working multiple languages. And one thing that's used widely is international symbols so that they're recognizable to everyone. And the interesting thing about the Jackson Hole Airport is it's a tourist destination, and they have so many people from around the world traveling there. And it's a very small airport. And again, this is thinking about the users, who's using the space, what's the information, what do you need to know in an airport, and especially a smaller airport. When you get to the airport, you need to know where's the ticketing counter if you need to get your ticket, where's security, where are the gates, the most important, where's the bathrooms, where are the restaurants, and there's international symbols for all of these things. So again, going back to things that we've already talked about is contrast, color, high contrast, simplicity, breaking up the information. In this case is, which way do I need to go? Straight, right, left, and what is it? Where is it that I'm going to get that information? So in doing that in this wayfinding program was really encapsulating the symbol, and then with the arrow, the direction next to it, so that it was just very simple. So you come off the plane, when you get off your plane, either you've had your bag on the plane or you need to get your bag. So only giving the information that you need in that location too. And I'm sure you've been places where you come up on a wayfinding sign and there's 30 things to look for, and it's really confusing. And what is in that location, what is it that you need to know? And that's the same thing when you're doing your website, or it's a newsletter, or it's when you come into your space, what do you need to know in that location, and not giving information overload. So there's also been some interesting developments in the accessibility symbol, and I don't have it shown here, but probably everybody is familiar with the stick wheelchair user, where it's like the head looks like it's falling off. And so it's been updated with more rounded, and then this is more of an action figure too. So I know we'll be sharing, AIGA has the whole set of symbols that you can download. And this is another regional airport in Eagle. in Vail. And again, they have a lot of travelers from around the world that speak multiple languages. This is a pretty simple wayfinding, but again, using symbols and numbers because those are universal. Everybody can understand that. And you need to know where the bathroom is, where to pick up your bags, where to get a drink. And then again, using really large symbols. So they're also, it's graphic and but it's also really simple. So you've got a flag mounted sign depending on which direction you're coming from. And then if you're coming straight on, you see a large symbol. So again, it's taking that user experience and how are people navigating a space, and it can still be a really nice design and fit in the space. But again, using that high contrast. And for instance, in this sign is breaking up the information so that you're giving straight ahead. Here's what's straight ahead. Here's what's down and to the left. And oftentimes you'll see signs where there's 3 lines of copy, and especially in airports and hospitals, another 3 lines, and there'll be a arrow straight, arrow left, arrow right. And the important thing about grouping messages, and that's the same thing when you're giving instructions and simplifying and grouping things. This is another document that we'll be sharing with you, and we're not really getting into signage and wayfinding, but there's guidelines with where your sign should be mounted, the heights, the areas, the height of the copy, where the tactile information needs to occur. They should always be on the strike side of the door. This is considered the strike side, and certain heights so that if you are reading Braille that you're not hit by the door, and then you know where to find it. And then there's a whole guide to viewing distances. So if you have an overhead sign in your facility, the copy needs to be at least 3 inches high. So this is a great tool too on distance. So there's a relationship between the height of your copy, from what distance, and what that viewing is. So something that I think you probably realized throughout this whole presentation, and I am going to ask you, is to respect the grid, please. That is so important in all communications, whether it's 2D or 3D. And then just the importance of simplifying things, like really think about it, simplify it. How can I make this simpler and easier to read? And going back into the signage, did you need to say restrooms? You saw the symbol. So that just adds either to the size of the sign or more information, and just that ability to really simplify. So I'm hoping that you have questions or comments or experiences that you've had that you want to share.
Thank you, Amy. That was really great. I think I can speak for all the participants here that it was really informative, really laid the groundwork for a lot of this really valuable information. So thank you. And folks, if you'd like to get on camera, or if you'd like to unmute, please feel free to do that. Or if you'd like to put your comments and questions in the chat. Something else that we'd like to do kind of just for fun is put up a poll. That's one of the fun features of Zoom, and get a sense of who you are and what you're interested in. So you should be able to see that, and we'll end polling in a few seconds, but we'd like to know more about you and your experience. Cool. I love this real time. All right, we'll end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and share the results. Looks like by and large, we've got a lot of individuals in this group who are part of a cultural organization. We have some professional graphic designers as well. And when it comes to our collective experience with accessibility practices, it looks like most of us are fairly familiar, but I love to see that there's some newbies in this group too. So hopefully this is exactly the kind of opportunity that we'd like to provide for people to, again, share their knowledge, expertise, and passion, and for us to kind of gain a little bit of insight. So yeah, I'd love to just open it up to the rest of the group here and just chat it out or shout it out. And thank you once again, Amy.
Hi, my name's Celia. I work at the History Museum here in Colorado, and among many things, I do graphic design, but exhibit design in general. And of course, there's always like the struggle of, I want this to look pretty and be attractive, and I want this to have all the words that the developer needs to put in there, you know, all the historical context. But you run into all of these issues, and I've been personally struggling with columns when we have a lot of text, because going straight across and having too many lines, even when you make the font size bigger, it just looks so massive, like a giant block. But then there's, I think, a lot of personal preferences. People go, well, I like how it looks like this better, or I think it's easier to read it like this. And you tend to get, it's like, well, yeah, everybody's different, and you can't ever please everybody. But I've been struggling, I think, with massive text, making it look stylish and colorful and attractive, but also being really consumable for all ages, and finding that right font size point. And then, sorry, I feel bad for the interpreter. Also, when you have like repetitive panels, where it's like, right now we have 30 panels telling different stories, and I feel like that's overwhelming. So I'd like to just get a little more feedback from other people on how they've dealt with something like that, if it's applicable. So.
I think one thing I find really sometimes challenging in exhibit design too, and in museum settings, is the lighting, particularly where the lighting has to be low in certain cases, and then it affects the readability.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's hard. So again, it's the contrast. And I wonder too, I've been in some museums where there's also written on a sheet of paper that you can take and then deposit at the end too, so that you're able to bring some of that with you in different sizes. And I know with COVID, that's, you know, probably a little hard right now. But again, I would go back to that point of simplifying too. And I think people tend to, if they want to read it all, will. I do think lighting is really important, that where you've got a lot of written information, that there's good light in that location. And then how far back to what that size of your copy is, because you're right, if you've got paragraphs of 1-inch copy, it starts to get so big. And are there ways to space it better throughout the exhibit?
Yeah, I think it's going to be an ongoing an ongoing issue no matter what. But it's just nice to kind of get some validation, or hearing that I'm not crazy for proposing certain things.
No, I think it's really hard, because you want it to look good. You want to have color, you want to have style, you want to have it branded, but it also needs to function.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a big fan of like colored panels with, I try to be careful about the high contrast, but making the font bigger when you have a colored background with a whiter or lighter text. I find that at least if the font's bigger, it's easier. Sorry, I'm not going to take up all your time. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. This is great. This is
Definitely.
fantastic.
It's a challenge for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd like to just share an example too, Celia. I'm not a exhibition designer at all at the Denver Art Museum, but I can just talk more anecdotally of how we've kind of started to approach that with essentially 2 examples. Definitely because of COVID, we had to really think about people congregating in front of a big timeline that we had for our Mexican Modernism show. And it was decided, kind of like you just mentioned, Amy, of giving something handheld that people could take with them. And it was like a simple, quick piece of paper, but it's exactly to your point. It's giving that choice that some people want to read every single thing that happened throughout this, hundreds of year timeline. Because exactly, in order to make it readable, we had to make it big enough, but then that meant it took up a huge amount of space. Another thing we have started to do, we're still trying to figure out feasibility of this moving forward, but is putting a lot of our exhibition text online so that people can access it through their smartphone. And right now we're calling these access guides, but it is where, again, you can think about what is the most important, simple information to put in the gallery physically, but then is there more information that people could access and be able to change the font size? If they have a, accessibility feature on their phone, they can listen to it. So again, pros and cons, because then also the assumption is that everybody has a smartphone, which we know is not the case. So pros and cons, but I just wanted to give those 2 examples.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. It's always great to hear from the field too, kind of what's going on. Anyone else?
I had a question about as as we continue to move more to like globalization and like in the internet, and like everyone around the world has access to certain parts of the world that they didn't like have before through the internet, and how it's especially interesting with language and how language plays a huge part in experiencing something. And I know on the internet, there's been huge leaps in being able to translate stuff and like have web pages all translated. But in the sense of a physical space, like if you need something translated, like if you need to have a Spanish translation or translate to Mandarin, like I just want to know your experience with that, and like and the type of people you work with in order to translate it, or like if you're working with the translator in order to be able to give them context of the things they are translating and everything like that.
First of all, Caleb, I love your background. That's wonderful. So fun. Experience when I was working on wayfinding projects where there were multiple languages, and yes, working with a translator from that aspect, because Google Translate's not a good idea. Or doing that yourself. And I have seen, most of our museums here, it's Spanish and English. So that's really great. And I guess I would look to the institutions that are here to talk about what you're doing with your translations. But I have also noticed on websites too, even Big Bud Press, I meant to show that, is you had the option to pick, I think there were like 12 different languages for their website. And I don't know if that's because they're known in those countries, but I think that those services are going to be more and more available, and they should be. So then I also, from a wayfinding standpoint, where you can do things simply with symbols for directing, because you're not going to be able to cover every single language of who your visitors are. But I'd be interested in knowing, like, the Denver Art Museum, what you're doing for languages other than Spanish.
That's a great question. So right now, yeah, we're definitely prioritizing Spanish, and that's because that's the feedback when we've really looked at who are the people that are coming to the museum the most. But I think you bring up a really good point, is that we know in Denver there are people that are speaking, you know, other languages besides that. So looking at how our programming could be more reflective of that. But to be perfectly transparent, I don't have a good answer. We're still trying to just get that information of who else is coming. So I don't know if there's other like organizations that are also talking about what they're doing too, beyond just collecting information.
Cool. Thank you, guys. I know it's an interesting challenge, and but it's awesome hearing from everybody and everyone else's experiences. Just a thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for raising that, Caleb. I think that's a really important point to bring up.
I think that point too is really interesting when you start to talk about Spanish, just because there's so many different dialects. And so when you're determining in the community that you're working in, and you're going to have Spanish, knowing locally what kind of, which dialect would be the most appropriate.
That's a great point. I know that we're now at the 1 o'clock hour, and I would love and encourage folks to kind of hang out for a little bit longer, because something else that we were curious about from Art of Access was getting a sense from you, the participants of these programs, what kinds of things you might be curious about learning next time. Again, these are kind of learning sessions, and thank you for the great feedback. I think this really resonated with this community, Amy, so thank you again. But if those of you who are still hanging out here, if you'd like to put it in the chat, or if you'd like to just speak up and say what you're curious about and what you'd like to learn next, and what we can bring to you. Are formatted quotes going to be a thing of the past? Good question. What are the thoughts on that from the design world?
It's been driving me nuts.
Yeah.
Because there are so many fonts that don't have them, and then you have to Frankenstein. And as a museum, especially history, you need to be accurate, and I get that, I respect that, but it really does seem like, you know, growing up, we were told we had to write our college papers in cursive or we wouldn't get into college. Mm-hmm. Never wrote it in cursive, you know, so it's like there's all these rules, and some of them are, for lack of better words, old school, and things are changing. And so if formatted quotes got ruled out by typewriters, like, and we're getting more fonts like Avenir and, you know, that don't have formatted quotes, what's the rule? And yeah, what's the standard now? So I'm curious if anybody else. Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Amy, or anyone else who's here?
That's a good question.
Good question. Something that we can marinate on a bit. I see that some of you have to jump off. That is perfectly all right. We appreciate having all of you here, sharing your commitment and sharing your virtual presence with us. So we'll see you again next time. Someone else is saying, hosting hybrid programs and making digital and in-person programs accessible. That is just the type of thing we've been talking about as a collective. So absolutely, Kimberly, we are with you there. We are on it. Any other thoughts or anything else that people are kind of pondering right now? I feel like there's a lot that we're kind of left with in this moment to just reflect on.
Well,
No?
I know that I'm continuing to learn and wanting to learn because things are changing, and I think it's just a matter of, keep trying and keep learning. And I know I'll make mistakes, and we're trying to make our website more accessible,
Mm,
all of those
yep.
things. And it does, it takes time. And I think it's, just keep setting those goals and moving towards them.
Yep. Yep. Wise. There's always going to be bumps in the road when it comes to implementing these kinds of practices. But I think that it's really good to stay informed, and I think we'll just kind of casually close things out, let people sort of drift off. Any last minute chats, we're going to be here for a little while longer. But again, on behalf of everyone at Art of Access, I just want to extend a huge thank you to you, Amy, and to everyone who is here today. Have an awesome rest of your afternoon and rest of your week.
Thank you. Respect the grid. Respect the grid.
Respect the grid. Yes. We leave you with these words. Respect the grid. We'll share resources. We'll share the PowerPoint. And all of that we'll share via email. So keep an eye out in your inboxes for that. All right.